Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here. I get to speak to a lot of people back in the United States in all kinds of different forms, but it's fun to be here and frankly inspiring, the reason that you all have come together and taken your time around human rights issues and the program that you have embarked on, and an opportunity to see if we can't connect some of the pieces that I work on with what you do. But it's great to be here. It's a little, I have to say, the setting that you've chosen is, I think Yana might appreciate that, it's a little bit disturbing to me, right? And it's intended to be, I believe. When Katrina hit in New Orleans, we went down, the National Wildlife Federation, we're the biggest environmental NGO, environmental group in the United States. We have 4 million members and supporters that support our work to protect wildlife. And we were going to have our annual meeting in New Orleans, and they had been obviously hit hard months before, and we went ahead and decided to go ahead and have it there anyway. We're bringing hundreds of people in from around the country. And we were the first major conference to be had at the hotels we stayed at, and everything was empty. And they really appreciated us being there. And we did some conservation projects while we were there, because the natural world was hit as well as people. But I'll never forget, going through the lower 9th Ward and the marks on the buildings. And this brings back a memory that, frankly, I think we would all like to forget. Right? And isn't that usually the case with human rights issues, right? That they're the things that we would like to forget. And you look at all the issues that you are going to be talking about, that you've already talked about today, that you'll be talking about moving forward. And there's a theme of a lot of human rights work, that they're trying to take us from the darkness behind us into the light. That there are wrongs in this world that are trying to be corrected, that there are better ways forward. But the environment, I would suggest, climate change in particular, global warming, but the environment is a different kind of human rights challenge. It's the missing chapter in the book of human rights, because the environment and climate change require us to think ahead to the darkness ahead of us if we don't act now. It requires us to listen to what scientists are telling us. It requires us to have our eyes open when Katrina hits. Yes, there was an engineering failure. Yes, there was a human response failure. Yes, there was a government failure with Katrina. But there was also an environmental failure. Because we know that hurricanes get their energy from heat. That's why they happen where I live in the summertime. They draw their energy from the heat in the water. And we know, and if you look at the data, it's very clear that the waters in the Gulf, when that really small hurricane moved over Florida, moved into the Gulf, Category 1, when that turned into Category 5, the waters in the Gulf were warmer than they just about ever been. There was a huge temperature anomaly. And we know that the pollution that we're pumping in the atmosphere as we burn oil as for our cars, as we burn coal for our electric power sources, that's creating that heat-trapping blanket, warming our planet, and we know for a fact that our temperatures worldwide have warmed. So would there have been a Hurricane Katrina without global warming? Probably. I don't know. Is there any question in my mind that the hurricane wouldn't have been as intense? That it would have been different? No, there's no question to me. I mean, the science is pretty sound. The scientists have warned about that ahead of time, and we saw it. Again, it was the engineering failure on top of the natural failure that led to the devastation that we saw, Ninth Ward, but it gives a very human face. 2,000 people died. We all remember what happened there. And so I recall that as I went back, and I had some pictures, but I'm sorry, we won't get to them here, but you can go to our website, and I'll tell you that afterwards, and you'll see lots of our stories and websites. When I traveled back a week after the Deepwater Horizons, the BP oil disaster, and flew into New Orleans and went down. And there are lessons again in what we saw. Right? Congress didn't pass the rules, the laws it should have passed. The regulators, instead of regulating and watching over industry, were often ex-oil industry officials themselves who planned eventually to go back and work for those companies, didn't do their job. The response plans that they promised they could clean up a worst case spill were designed, amongst other things, to save walruses. There are no walruses in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a bad case of cut and paste plagiarism. Right? There was no serious response plans for anything of this magnitude. All the decisions, and there were many of them, the actual events that led to that disaster, all could be tied to the need for speed, the need for profit, no attention to what could happen if things went wrong. And we saw what happened when things went wrong. We saw it when we got down there. These coastal communities that had been, and they talked about it. It's like, we can't believe this is happening to us again. Right? I mean, how do we're just coming out from what we saw 5 years ago, and here we are, and once again, everything's at a standstill. Fishermen couldn't fish. People at a restaurant, except for the media, didn't have any business. And it was hard on them. And it was hard on wildlife. And obviously, that's what motivates our members, was a big part of the response and the big reason we were there. But in protecting, in coastal Louisiana, you get a real sense of this interconnection between nature and protecting wildlife and protecting people. Go back to Katrina for a moment. Right? The problems that led to Katrina were also the fact that we had been losing the wetlands at a rate of, back home I say a football field every 45 minutes. That would be a soccer pitch, basically, right? Less than an hour, right? We're losing the wetlands. These wetlands are being lost for several reasons. One of which is the oil companies for decades have been cutting canals through the wetlands to make their shipping easier and their pipelines easier, and that allows for saltwater intrusion back. That was then undermining the habitat. So you have sea levels rising, slowly but surely because of climate change. You have all these factors that then take away the sponge that would have helped with that storm surge. And more importantly, in Bangladesh and other coastal communities around the world, those coastal communities are going to need our wetlands that are now being threatened by a rising sea. All these connections that we see, but again, you go back, it wasn't that anybody set out to hurt the fishermen. It wasn't that anybody set out to hit the people that lived in that bayou communities for so long, but it happened because we didn't look forward. Right? And we didn't look at the cost. And so with climate change, and I'm not sure, I suspect, given your interest in these topics, I suspect a number of you have a good fundamental understanding of climate change. But let me just mention from a human rights element that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is 20 years of science now, an unprecedented global scientific effort to put those headlights into the darkness ahead of us and say, what will the world look like if we fail to act? Their report 2 years ago said that hundreds of millions of people, hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people will suffer from lack of access to clean water as a result of climate change. Up to a sixth of the world's population rely on water supplies that originate from glaciers, mountains. They're melting. They melt earlier in the spring, changing the entire climate and hydrology. Water, water, water. Too much water in some places, too little access to clean water in others. In Africa, in the last couple of years, the drought has been so intense. I was over there for the climate talks three or so years ago in Kenya, and I got to visit with the Maasai tribe. The Maasai tribe, some of those tribes I mean, the water has political implications, it's human survival, and at least the confrontations between them and nature. I mean, the lions, when the zebra populations get decimated, the lions come in and go for their cattle. Right? But again and again and again, whether it's in the United States, Katrina, whether it's in Bangladesh, whether it's in Africa, it's the poorest and most vulnerable, and frankly, those who have contributed usually the least to the problem that stand on the other end. And that's, to me, what makes it a human rights issue. That's what makes this the missing chapter, which is, can you look forward not only to future generations who have to be part of that equation, and I think you had someone make that point earlier today, but also globally and within our backyards to deal with the facts that it's the most vulnerable who are going to be impacted. There's a wildlife dimension to this as well, because I, for one, believe that people who grow up in a world without wildlife, in a world that does not have the natural resources that we have today, are also the poor. There's a rights dimension to that as well, but obviously that is what makes climate change for National Wildlife Federation is the top of our agenda. Now, we're not like World Wildlife Fund that has global operations. I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. We really focus in America. We recognize this is a global problem. We recognize that most of these issues have global dimensions to them, and we work in that context as well. But our job is to educate Americans who support us, to work in Congress, to work with the president, to work with the regulators of the oil companies and others in order to protect wildlife. And the wildlife dimensions of this are equally profound. I mean, the same report 2 years ago said not a few species could go extinct from this, but a third of all species, plants and animals, could go extinct or be on the road to extinction in the life of a child born today. That's a wildlife issue, it's a natural resources issue, but for my son and my daughter, I consider it a rights issue as well, because how could we possibly tell them that that happened on our watch in such a short period of time? Right, the United Nations Secretary General just announced last week, this is the 10th anniversary now of the Biodiversity Convention. And the goal of the Biodiversity Convention is to significantly slow the rate of biodiversity. And as they approached the 10-year anniversary, he said, not only are we failing to meet that goal, but it has accelerated. So we need to be very careful it's very important that we set our goals high, but we have to get back down to brass tacks. We have to get back down to reality too and actually do something about it. And so many of you who aren't from the United States are wondering, why aren't we doing more about it when it comes to the environment and climate change? If I can hazard a guess. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating that the world's not doing more. It's frustrating that we're not doing more. We had a big fight in Congress this year to push forward a clean energy bill, to push forward emission limits. It did not get passed, made it through the House. It was the first time ever, significant progress. We had a majority of support in the Senate, but we couldn't overcome the politics of the day, which was to block everything. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We can get into it in question and answer. I've talked to a lot of folks who have been interested in that, but I don't want to dive into it too deeply here. But I do want to say, remember that in any democracy, like the United States, if you're going to succeed in a movement, whether it's rights, the environment, the nexus of both, protecting wildlife, dealing with climate change, clean energy, it's got to come from the bottom up. And generally, the public gets it, despite what you may think, because Congress is slow to act. The public realizes that this is a problem and they want action. Not everybody, but a majority. Cities are acting. We have, when George Bush walked away from the Kyoto Protocol, we had almost 1,000 mayors step forward and said, we're going to reduce pollution. We have cities like Portland, and there are a lot of cities here in Germany that are good models, far ahead of where we are in the States, but there are cities that have more sustainable transportation networks that are trying to do a lot more with efficiency. We made a big investment with our stimulus money in energy efficiency, 2 cities and others. And states are acting as well. Our state governments are moving forward with renewable energy standards. 29 of our 50 states have renewable energy standards, but it's not enough. In fact, if anything from the science, and you look at that science report from 2 years ago, and you see that the projections they make are actually, as scary as it may be, conservative. That is, the actual change that we're observing in the real world, if you look at the rate at which the Arctic ice cap is melting, you look at the rate at which the Greenland ice sheet is melting, or you look at the changes that we can just see all around us in the warming temperatures, are actually much faster than they ever projected. So it means we need to be accelerating and we're moving slowly. But we are going to keep fighting. There is an effort that not a lot of folks understand that the Obama administration has undertaken to essentially move forward without Congress and regulate both tailpipe pollution from cars, automobiles, and now moving into smokestack pollution from power plants, from industrial sources, from others, and to require limits and reductions. And the oil companies have spent over $500 million since Obama was elected, along with the electric utilities, the power companies, to lobby Congress and in campaign contributions to try to stop the legislation that ultimately did get stopped, but also to try to get Congress to stop President Obama from moving forward with those regulations. We had a vote a couple of months ago and we beat them, not by a lot. We got 53 votes. It took a majority to win, which is 51, right? And we got 53. The elections are coming up. This isn't a big and prominent issue in the elections, which is usually the case, which is probably ultimately the reason that we haven't actually gotten across the finish line with big, bold changes. When George Bush was elected president, American views on the environment were never quite as bad as Dick Cheney's, and probably overall American views on the environment were never quite as good as people's aspirations for Barack Obama. They get elected on other issues. President Obama was the first president, I think, to really be elected largely with significant help from the youth, young voters who turned out to vote on clean energy and the environment. So that's a possible changing point. And maybe we'll see more on that in this election, but this election is going to be dominated, this midterm is going to be dominated by other factors. With the economy the way it is, with one party in charge, which Americans always end up voting out. Whenever you have one party in charge of the Senate and the House and the President, they always want to restore a balance. There's some trends, underlying trends, that are going to probably speak louder this election than the environment. But we're making progress. And I think ultimately that it is the young folks that are going to have to make the difference on this. There's an event coming up as you guys go home. I don't know if any of you know Bill McKibben, and he has this organization called 350.org. But there's an event coming up on October 10th, 10-10-10, that there's over 5,000 people around the world that have, or 5,000 groups have signed up to take action, to do something about climate change. So that's one message I would just want to leave with you as you carry back, that that's something you can look into and sign up and think about, is this something that we're going to look forward on and actually do something about? There was, if this thought that occurred to me when you mentioned where you were when the wall came down. Because when the Apollo landed on the moon, we put the first man on the moon. The average age of the people back in ground control was, I think it was 27. Well, think about that. That means they were 18, 19, 20, when Kennedy made the call. We don't have a Kennedy to make the call on tackling climate change, tackling environmental issues, oil pollution in the Gulf, oil pollution in Niger, rising sea levels. We may not have that luxury, but all the information is right there. It's right there in front of us. We have to be able to envision that future with different clean energy. We actually do something about it. And a lot of those people might be here in the room. So take a look at the 10-10-10, because it's going to take everyone around the world to get this thing done. And I see a lot of leadership here, knowing what the program that you put together and the folks that have volunteered to come here. So take a look at that. And thanks for bearing with me as I ad-lib my way through this discussion with you, and you freeze. And I don't know if we want to do jumping jacks, but we can at least go to questions and try to get some energy that way. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Emily Babcock. I'm from the UK. I just wonder what your view is on, I mean, there are obviously certain countries who like you say, being America potentially is one, China another, who sort of specifically have been blocking chances and developments of climate change bills and whatever. I was wondering, would it make a big difference if Europe presented a vote as one vote of all of Europe or EU or whatever, or are more voices
Right.
louder? I don't know, your opinion on that.
I think on the environment, well, yeah, everybody heard the question, you're back there. I think on the environment, we're moving away from a formal voting system. In fact, in the United Nations Framework Convention process has always been a unanimous process, which has really been its fundamental challenge from the beginning. And it's not just the United States at different times has problems, or China at different times, but also countries like Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations. I think what happened in Copenhagen for the last climate talks was interesting in that respect. What happened is, at the end of the day, it was leaders, a smaller gathering of leaders of 20 nations or so that got in the room together. And Chancellor Merkel was there, and there were not all, but many European voices in that room. And those voices were the most passionate, not the most passionate, no, I should take that back. There's many nations are passionate on this issue, but the most willing to put forth a plan of action of their own from a significant emitting nations. And I think that's important. I think there needs to be more than one voice, but I think it's about leadership and voices and about personal diplomacy at this point as it is a voting right. And I think that's what's important. I think prime ministers making this a top agenda item amongst all the many items that they have to deal with is going to be the most important thing.
Thank you. Next, please.
I just wanted to add as well that another part of the exhibit upstairs, the flags that you saw, they're specifically in reference to the oil spill. And if you look at them more carefully, it's sort of a reflection that, as you say, that things haven't ended for Katrina, but for New Orleans. But at the same time, I think it's really significant that you're here as well, and that sort of recognize the role of individual citizens, even where governments fail. Maybe also just to your point, I think that it's hugely significant that there be sort of national level and international agreements and so on. But really, a lot of the work is in the implementation, and it's if everybody's sort of playing this game of trying to match what everybody else is doing, not doing too much, that they're not
Right.
economically disadvantaged. It's very easy for this all to fall apart. So I mean, it really is sort of the work of citizens all around the world to push their governments.
It absolutely is only going to happen to the extent that civil society and citizens keep pushing and pushing hard, I think the bad news coming out of Copenhagen, and I don't expect good things out of Cancun, the talks that will come up later this year, is the lack of any kind of a solid science-based plan for tackling climate change. The good news is that there's a change in attitude that is starting to happen everywhere in different degrees, where this used to be a question of polar bears or jobs. Are you going to be on the side of protecting wildlife, or are you going to be on the side of making sure you actually have a job and can feed your family? That's what our opponents always try to marginalize environmental debates as. Of course, the reality is sustainability is essential to a good economy. And more importantly, we now, more and more people recognize that clean energy and sustainable investments now are actually an economic opportunity. And so China, which is an increasingly big source of emissions, as you know, is making huge investments in clean energy. In fact, I went to one of the biggest, or the biggest, investor renewable energy company dialogues in New York. We had a contact that let us in kind of a ringside seat. And what it is the CEOs and the chief financial officers of the big renewable energy companies, clean energy companies, get to come in and make a quick pitch to banks and other investors to give them venture money to keep growing. Hugely important. This is where the rubber meets the road in terms of where the money's going in the world. And many of them were making the pitch that they were getting 10 million here, or 20 million here to move this factory from the United States to China, to build this operation in China. China's doing a renewable city, this. That's good in the sense that we need global progress everywhere. It's not so good that the United States responded to that by failing to pass legislation to get our own industry back in the game and back moving, because we need to see everyone committing to that. And that ultimately is where the solution will come from, is the citizens acting, and then the technology push as we find solutions and model solutions, so that we can actually see it work. Because I'm losing confidence in the ability of a global system to show the resolve to both arrive at the right international agreement and then actually live up to it. And the biological diversity agreement is an illustration and point that they have the right goal, but they haven't lived up to it. Yes?
Hi, Molly from Parliament from San Francisco. I was just wondering, obviously it's a massive investment opportunity, but the fact that there is so, we're in the economic crisis, there is so little startup capital available.
Right.
American cities simply don't have public transport networks. Many Americans cannot live without a car. And the fact that so many states their industries rely on cars or oil. Like, do you think it's economically feasible for us to become environmentally sustainable within our lifetime, another lifetime? Like, do you think this is practicable?
I actually absolutely agree, do think that it's doable. I think you can get started now, but the lack of capital is a huge impediment right now, like you're saying, to renewable energy companies and investors who are now looking at the fact that Washington did an act and saying, uh-oh, so we're going to have to move, particularly at the state level, to try to push things forward in the meantime. But at the end of the day, you're going to need to change the system. And the system says right now, the free market system, which is very effective at getting results, says, here's the results we want. Pollution pays. Go for it. The more that you pollute, the more carbon dioxide you emit, no problem. There's no financial disincentive for putting pollution there. Until that changes and the financial rewards say clean pays, cleaner pays, there's a financial benefit to actually reducing carbon dioxide, you're not going to get investment at the scale that's needed for the long term for the significant. That's why we're going to need to get, whether it's a cap and trade program, whether it is a regulatory system through states and through EPA or through other governments, wherever your governments may be, whatever the system is, that in each nation needs to be put in place. There has to be a price for pollution in order to get the capital flowing at the levels needed. And they have to be able to see with certainty that that price is going to go up over time. So when you're looking 20 years out, you know it doesn't make sense anymore to build new infrastructure that's going to pollute, like the tar sands pipeline that they now want to build from Canada to destroy boreal forests up in Canada, turn it into a toxic pit that harms wildlife and waterfowl and birds as much as anything you ever saw out of the Gulf spill. And then they're going to take that and they're going to pump 900,000 barrels a day down to Texas to refine it. So you have more greenhouse gases, more risk of spills. I mean, that kind of investment, until it just doesn't make financial sense, we're going to have a hard time turning around for the long term. But I think locally, states and other nations need to just keep pushing to get that money out there. Yes.
Hello, I'm Laura. I come from Italy, but I live in Berlin since here. I wanted to ask if you know if there is any institution or mechanism that can check where some investments on renewable energies comes from. Because there was some research in the last time, and looks like that the mafia in the last years is really interested to make investment on renewable energies. So I wanted to ask if there is somebody that check where this money comes from.
I've never heard that before.
I can let you know where this article, because this was an article on an Italian newspaper that is called Internazionale, that collect all the best articles from newspaper all over the world.
Yeah.
If you are in the next days,
Okay.
again, I will let you know
Yeah.
where is the source.
I learn something new every day. I will say one thing on the topic of investment. One thing that clearly needs to be changed to increase investment in renewable energy, moving slightly from where you were talking about, but we have immense amount of capital flowing to developing countries through the World Bank and the IMF and global financial institutions. And there has been a push, and we've been pushing, and others, to shift that money into renewable energy projects. And it looked like we were starting to finally get some traction and make some progress, but they just approved, the IMF just approved a 3,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant loan for India. 3,000 megawatt, I mean, they don't get any bigger than that post. I mean, that is a legacy of pollution that is frightening. And I don't mean to single out India, because the United States is still building coal plants, as well as other industrialized nations too, but why can't we start by putting the international monetary flows towards clean energy sources instead of towards more pollution? Because once you build these things, they're going to be awfully hard to close down. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I don't know if you heard about the Green Wall and the Green Sahara. There is a project. There was, I think, 2 weeks ago, a conference in Vienna about in Vienna, Austria, about a project in Africa, dreamed by the previous Nigerian president, about a green wall.
No, I haven't heard of it. Tell us a little bit about the Green Wall.
Yes, I think with the implementation of the Chinese investment, they would like to settle, I think, trees,
Yeah.
to implement a kind of a green wall in the Sahara.
Right.
The project is to save the globe or something like that.
That's great.
I wanted to ask you.
No, I haven't heard about it.
And
I'll-
if implemented, can we really expect beneficial issues?
Yeah, I don't know about the Green Wall. The question was about the Green Wall project in Africa, which China is helping finance. I don't know about it, but a couple thoughts on potential benefits. One thing we haven't talked about in climate change much is because climate change is happening today, it is going to require us to reinvent how we protect natural resources, the environment, wildlife, right? Take in the United States, for example, we've created a whole system of parks and natural wildlife refuges where there's development around them, and then we protect the place. Well, now, if they're coastal, the sea levels coming up, eroding the wetland space, or if they're inland or anywhere, the climate zones are shifting. At different rates, you would have the right zone for a certain kind of tree, moving north, species moving, pests moving. It requires a completely new strategy that requires corridors, amongst other things, to actually figure out how to help wildlife adapt as best we can, even as we try to slow the rate of climate change. And it's going to be an immense challenge, and that's something that we're working on a lot in the United States. I haven't heard about the Green Wall. The fact that China invested in it doesn't surprise me so much. They are embarking on what seems to be a very successful strategy of diplomacy, financial diplomacy, throughout Africa, including environmental and renewable energy projects. They're very tightly partnered at the climate negotiations and other environmental negotiations, the G77, the groups of developing countries. And there are, they have a very smart and well thought out, far ahead thought out diplomatic strategy. And they're using their money, actually, United States money that we all borrowed from China, and they hold our collateral. That's actually one of the things that's motivating people back home in the United States is Americans don't like to fall behind, and we don't like to be second, and we want to be first and helping in the race to clean energy, and be selling technology, not buying technology. That's something we're going to keep talking about as people get mobilized to actually do something on this. You all look like you're going to freeze. I think we need to.
Jeremy, speaking of natural resources, we are running quite low on actually many resources at this moment, including also daylight. But I just wanted to again express my gratitude, as well as the gratitude of all of my colleagues and all of the participants here of the conference for, I think, sharing some very important insights. I think this is such a crucial issue for cultural diplomacy, for human rights. And ultimately, I think the challenge that you give us all is to ask this question: what is our responsibility? Is the environment your responsibility, or is it our responsibility? The same thing goes for human rights. And I think there we'll have a lot of food for thought for the rest of the evening. So if you could all please join me in a very, very warm thank you for us.
Thank you.